Welcome everyone, I'm Dorothea Breier. I'm a postdoc at the Department of Cultures at University of Helsinki, where I also did my PhD. And with my postdoc, I changed the field. Before I was more in migration studies, and now I turned to urban activism and sustainability issues. And this is something that I will also present today. So I will talk about the potential of grassroots initiatives in the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I will first provide some background information on those Sustainable Development Goals, assuming that not necessarily everyone is that familiar with them. And I will begin with giving you the basically, or probably the most cited definition of sustainable development, which was created by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which is better known as the Brundtland Commission. So in 1987, they published a report in which they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And even though this might sound a bit vague and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, it still provides a basis for the discussion that is still going on what is sustainability and how do we achieve that. And in those discussions, sustainability is usually understood as a triple bottom line of three different dimensions. First, the environmental dimension, the economic dimension, and the social dimension. And basically, those dimensions are interconnected. So if you focus on only two of those, it's not that sustainable. However, it was often criticized that especially the social dimension was and is largely neglected. So most of the discussions turn on environmental issues, resources, and also the economical development. And even in 2015, when the United Nations had a solutions summit in which they launched the Sustainable Development Goals, they still acknowledged that we need to pay more attention to the social dimension of sustainability. This is something they tried to do in the Social Development Goals. There was the so-called Agenda 2030, which fleshed out 17 themes or goals to work on for the next 15 years in order to have a more sustainable world. And if we look a bit more into detail at those goals, we can see that they did try to cover different aspects, including social aspects. So we do find goals related to equality, gender equality, health and well-being, education, and so on. Even though there is a notion that we do need to focus on the social aspects of sustainability, still they appear to be quite hard to actually work on. From a research point of view, the concept of social sustainability is not the easiest. So until today, it lacks a proper definition. So scholars refer to this as a chaotic concept, which is definitely understudied. And reasons for this might be that aspects related to social issues and so on are just harder to grasp. They are quite often subjective and intangible. And we have to face that there appears to be a wider acceptance for seemingly neutral quantitative data. So for instance, urban sustainability is largely understood in technoscientific terms because they are easier to assess and easier to handle. However, I consider social sustainability as a concept that is still useful to understand lived experiences of people in societies. And also scholars acknowledge that as a meta-concept, it does have the potential to basically facilitate a debate on a larger basis, on a broader basis. Like so many other concepts as well, we need to define it, that's the thing. And there are attempts to define sustainability, for instance, and social sustainability, for instance, by fleshing out certain key principles, like equity, democracy, social engagement, social inclusion and diversity, a sense of the place and safety and security, and also the quality of the built environment. And looking at those key principles, we again see that there are some of those aspects are rather objective, some of the aspects are rather subjective, and some of them are both at the same time. So one way of working on social sustainability is to combine qualitative methods and quantitative methods. And I did bring an example just to show you briefly how it can be done, how it can be utilized. There is an organization called Social Life. It's UK-based, a research center working on urban matters. And this is one example. They did basically defined 4 dimensions of social sustainability, which they in turn use to assess, for instance, a place like a certain town in the UK. This tiny picture here shows how it can look then as a result. So basically, this is like a town called Corbin. They did an assessment and found out that, okay, social and cultural life is doing quite well, but for instance, social infrastructure could require some more attention. And this is knowledge that can be very useful for city planning and city development. So, coming to the second main aspect of my presentation, I want to talk about the potential of grassroots initiatives in creating more sustainable societies. To explain this on a rather general level, I draw on a work on grassroots innovation movements, which is a specific form of grassroots initiatives, but I still find it useful to make my point clear. So Smith and others, they basically defined those grassroots movements as forms of organizations that are primarily civic-driven. And as such, they are less limited by institutional constraints or disciplinary boundaries. And for that reason, they do have the potential to identify issues and questions that are otherwise disregarded by institutions, and also find solutions to those issues in a different way by thinking outside the box. So for Smith, those grassroots movements, they may generate bottom-up solutions for sustainable developments, solutions that respond to the local situation and the interests and values of the communities involved. So, all of this forms the background for my research, and as an ethnologist, I'm mostly familiar to qualitative studies and qualitative methods, and this is what I've been doing so far. I work on grassroots initiatives in Helsinki that try to find solutions to perceived issues, specifically in a social context, and in this create a more sustainable, socially more sustainable society here in Helsinki. And I aim at working on 3 different areas. First of all, I want to look, or I am looking at the initiatives as such, so what they are doing, what are the issues they perceive, and how do they respond to them. Second, their relationship to authorities. And third, the role of the physical space or space in all of this. Basically, I started by doing interviews with different activists in Helsinki, and then I found one group that I found particularly relevant and interesting, which is a group called Loco. Loco consists of young adults that try to create a subcultural center. Until the end of last year, 2018, they were using the premises of Oranssi in Suvilahti, but soon they will open their own space in Kallio. And basically they used 3 different formats. First of all, a weekly cafe called Happy Monday Cafe. Second, I think they were monthly, some arts and culture workshops. And on some of the weekends they organized some concerts and other performances. So far so good, but you may ask how this relates to the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned. So I want to basically tell you a bit more about the agendas and ideals Loco has for you to understand why I find them very relevant. So basically it turned out that Loco has really elaborate ideas and ideals and also solid criticism on society and the cultural institutes in Helsinki. Or not just in Helsinki actually, but and one criticism refers to placelessness of certain young adults. So I will illustrate this with one quote of one of the active members of Loco, Mirjami, who told me, We can't go to the youth centers anymore, and we don't want to go to the youth centers anymore. But we would really want a space that we could use, especially during the winters, where we could just go and hang out and maybe like do something like workshops and people's kitchens and just listening to music and hang out. And we don't have that. So for young adults who are, on the one hand, too old to go to youth centers, but on the other hand, not adult as in affluent enough to go to the city and basically purchase the right to urban space, there doesn't seem to be a place to go to. So to put it in other words, if you don't have the money to meet your friends in a cafe or a bar, where do you actually go and socialize? Most people, most young people, well, most, I'm not quite sure actually, but let's say a large number of young people live in small rooms in shared apartments or tiny studio apartments, so there is not that much space to actually just meet some friends. And it's quite easy to fall into a vicious circle of social isolation and depression if you live in those conditions. The way Loco reacts to it is to create spaces to just hang out. So basically you can just go there, you can hang out, you have no pressure to purchase anything, to buy anything, you can just be there in a way. So this Monday cafe that I mentioned, they offer some treats, some snacks and so on. And if you have some money, you can donate some money. If you don't, you don't. It's all right. The other pillar of Loco's events is to provide a low threshold access to arts and culture. And connected to this is a criticism on the exclusivity and a perceived inaccessibility of cultural institutions. And once more, I will provide you a quote from an interview, again with Miriami, who said, "There are different things that stop you from going to places. It's not just about, are the doors wide enough and stuff like that. It's also, a big deal of it is social and psychological. And I have noticed many times when I wanted to go somewhere, and then I feel like people are just staring at me and wondering if I'm gonna steal something from there. And for people that have different kinds of problems with discrimination regarding their sexual orientation or gender identity, and different kinds of mental sickness and anxiety and so on, it's harder to go to some like cultural event at Korjaamo where there are all these beautiful people sipping on the Aperol Spritz and watching some short films that their friends directed on his year in India. It's a lot harder than going to some crumbly building in Suvilahti, where we have been saying on the internet that you don't need any money and you don't need fancy clothes, you can just come here." And this feeling of exclusion from mainstream cultural institutions can have many reasons. So how Miriami put it, if you experience discrimination because of the way you look or your gender identity or your social abilities and so on, you might just not feel that welcome in certain institutions like galleries, museums, cultural centers and so on. And Loco, in fact, did some survey and a social media campaign before they got active, in which they asked people to share their experiences and share their views on this, what prevents them from going to such places. And this is exactly what showed in this. So there's like a certain number of young adults that don't feel welcome to go to cultural places. And Loco found different strategies to work against this. The first is to try to create a safer space, which means that they have explicit safer space rules, which are stated, for instance, on their website. That's a screenshot. It might be a bit small for you to see, but they state those rules officially on their website, in the event descriptions on Facebook and so on, and they act accordingly. So this shows in the content of the program, in the implementation of the activities, in the language that they use, and also in the reactions to situations in which someone violates those rules. The second is that Loco understood that it's hard for some to go to unknown places and to socialize with strangers. So for this, they developed another strategy. So Miriami, again, told me, "We have noticed that different kinds of people come there, and most of them don't know us or each other. And when there's something little crafty to do, even like just knitting, it happens that people, strangers, just gather and then they start talking with each other." So basically, Loco offers something to do during their events. During the Monday cafes, there's usually something like cross-stitching, political cross-stitching, or making pins, or doing some collage, or something like this, because Loco understood that it breaks, first of all, it's easy to break the ice between people, that they start chatting. At the same time, it's possible for people to go there and kind of be in another surrounding, be amongst people, but they don't have to talk. They can also just sit there and do something. It's just a good reason to basically go to a place, even if you don't know anyone there. You can do something there. So this is one of the strategies. And in this, they also give some access to handicrafts and forms of arts, which is actually another agenda of Loco. So Loco tries to make the access to arts and cultures as low threshold as possible. So because of this, their workshops are free of charge. You don't need any prior skills to go there. And also the activities are made in a way that even people who have disabilities can come there and join and participate. Regarding their concerts and performances, they actually do take some entrance fee in order to pay the artists, but it's always possible for people to volunteer at the events and get in for free by doing that. So, by telling you about Loco's activities, I tried to show their value, why I consider them relevant, and I consider them as contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I did put some of them, and I think that Loco responds to those in their activities and principles. And to cite this Smith once more, Loco does create a bottom-up solution that responds to the local situation and the interests and values of the community involved. So to conclude, I actually just want to say a few more sentences about how a study like this and knowledge produced in a study like this is relevant and how it can be applied. So Smith also mentioned that quite often there is a misconception by politicians and city developers to think that if there's a bottom-up solution which is working well, they can just upscale it, like use it somewhere else. Why not? The tricky thing is that those solutions have been growing over time and they respond to specific local issues under local conditions. So this also shows in the interview material. So Vilja, another active member of Loco, said that you can't fake diversity. If you would want to have more minorities in a project, for instance, you can't really do that unless you reach out in a way that would include them in the operations in a way. I feel that the group working with Loco is also the people we are doing it for. It comes from us because we are part of the people we would want to reach out to anyway. So basically, to really conclude, we need to acknowledge that such spaces like Loco is creating, those safer spaces for marginalized people, cannot be created artificially. Thinking of cultural institutions, it's not enough to just include some quota minorities and think you're all of a sudden an inclusive space. It doesn't work like this. It has to grow from within the group. Instead, what municipalities and institutions could do is to provide support for groups like Loco by offering advice, by offering funding and spaces for them to create self-governed spaces and self-governed solutions. And this is what I want to conclude with. Thank you for your attention.